I think my mother did exactly the right thing. I think it's absolutely extraordinary.
Before Diana's death, she called Harry. Silently, quietly, they spoke. Nobody knew what was said in that room, but Princess Anne heard, and she decides it's time to talk. The secret Diana carried to her grave. There are secrets that die with people, and then there are secrets that refuse to stay buried. This is one of those secrets. Princess Diana died on August 31st, 1997, in a tunnel in Paris. The world stopped. Billions mourned. Flags fell to half-mast across the globe. 2 young boys lost their mother in the most violent and sudden way imaginable. William was 15, Harry was 12. The palace moved quickly after that. Statements were issued, arrangements were made. The machinery of the monarchy ground forward the way it always does. Efficient, controlled, cold. But something happened in the weeks before that tunnel. Something the palace never put in any statement. Something that was never read aloud at any memorial. Diana had been preparing, not for death exactly, but for the possibility of it. And before the end came, she spoke to Harry. What she said in that conversation has never been fully confirmed, not publicly or officially. The palace has never acknowledged it. Royal biographers have circled around it for years without landing. Even those closest to Diana in her final months only knew pieces of it, until now. Because Princess Anne, the woman who watched all of it unfold from the inside, has finally spoken, and what she has revealed has torn open a wound that many inside the royal family believed had finally closed. But before we get to what Anne said, we need to understand why Diana felt the need to say anything at all. We need to go back to the summer of 1997 and understand the state of mind Diana was in during the last weeks of her life, because that context changes everything. By the summer of 1997, Diana was in a complicated place emotionally. The divorce from Charles had been finalized the previous year. The settlement had been reached. Her HRH title had been stripped away. She had been pushed to the edges of the institution she had entered as a young woman, when she entered with almost no preparation for what awaited her. But Diana had not broken. She had rebuilt. She had thrown herself into humanitarian work with an intensity that stunned even her harshest critics. Her campaign against landmines had taken her to Angola and Bosnia. She had walked through fields that still held the remnants of war. She had held children whose limbs had been taken by buried explosives. She had done it all on camera, and without apology. The world had responded to her. Not to the palace version of Diana, to the real one. And that terrified certain people inside Buckingham Palace more than almost anything else. Because Diana was no longer a royal wife who could be managed or contained. She was a global figure operating entirely outside the institution's control. She had her own platform, her own voice, her own army of public support that dwarfed anything the monarchy could manufacture. She was also a mother, and that above everything else is what drove the conversation she had in those final weeks. Sources who were close to Diana in the summer of 1997 have spoken over the years about her state of mind. Many of those accounts describe a woman who was simultaneously more at peace than she had been in years, and more anxious than anyone around her fully understood. The peace came from her work, from her sense of purpose, and the feeling that she was finally living the life she was meant to live rather than the life the palace had designed for her. The anxiety came from her boys. Diana worried about William and Harry constantly. Not in the ordinary way that mothers worry about their children. She worried in a specific and deeply informed way. She knew the palace. She knew how the institution worked and had lived inside it for 16 years. She had watched it reshape people, flatten them, sand down their edges until they fit the shape the family required. She did not want that for her sons, and she was particularly worried about Harry. William was the heir. His path was fixed in ways that could not be altered. The weight of the crown would fall on him eventually, and both Diana and William understood that. There was a clarity to William's future, even in its heaviness. Harry's situation was different. Despair. That word has followed Harry his entire life. It followed him before he could even understand what it meant. Inside the palace, the role of despair has always been quietly understood as both essential and secondary, present as backup, visible enough to support the heir, but never quite the center of anything. Diana saw what that dynamic was already doing to her youngest son. Harry was 12 years old in the summer of 1997. He was funny, warm, and fiercely loyal. He adored his mother with an openness that William, older and more guarded, had already learned to temper. Harry wore his love for Diana on his face. Everyone who saw them together in those years remarked on it. And Diana saw in that love something that concerned her deeply. She saw vulnerability, and a child who would need guidance that the palace would never provide. She saw a boy who would grow into a man inside an institution that did not fully know what to do with him. She saw someone who would be pulled in directions that could either define him or destroy him. And so, she made a decision. She decided to tell him something specific, something she believed he would need to hold on to when she was no longer there to guide him. What exactly that something was has been debated and whispered about inside royal circles for nearly 3 decades. Fragments have surfaced in biographies, hints have appeared in interviews, but the full picture has never emerged, until Princess Anne decided that silence had protected the wrong people for long enough. What Anne knows goes beyond rumor. It goes beyond secondhand accounts and palace gossip. Anne was there. Anne saw and heard things. And Anne has been carrying the weight of that knowledge through every royal controversy, every public battle, every headline about Harry and Meghan for almost 30 years. The question is why she chose now to speak, and the answer to that question is more unsettling than almost anyone expected. Anne steps forward and breaks the silence. Princess Anne does not do interviews. That is not an exaggeration. It is not a characterization. It is simply a fact that anyone who follows the royal family understands without needing to be told. Anne is the most hard-working member of the Windsor family by almost every measurable standard. She carries out more public engagements than any other royal year after year. She shows up and does the work. She does not sit down and open old wounds for public consumption, which is exactly why what happened in early 2026 sent shockwaves through every royal press room in Britain. Anne spoke. Not in a carefully managed palace statement filtered through 3 layers of communications staff, or in a brief comment to a reporter at a public engagement. She spoke at length, with clarity, and she spoke about Diana. The moment that triggered it did not come from nowhere. To understand why Anne finally broke her silence, you have to understand what had been building inside the royal family in the months leading up to her decision. Because Anne did not wake up one morning and spontaneously decided to reopen the most painful chapter in the monarchy's modern history. Something pushed her. By late 2025, the tension inside the palace around Harry had reached a level that insiders described as unsustainable. Harry had spent years dismantling his relationship with the institution from the outside. The interviews, memoir, and the documentary. Each one had landed like a controlled explosion inside palace walls. They had forced the family to absorb another round of public scrutiny while maintaining the appearance of dignified silence. The palace had managed it, barely, but it had managed it. Then came the development that changed Anne's calculus entirely. Sources close to the royal family confirmed that in the autumn of 2025, serious conversations began about the possibility of Harry returning to some form of official royal role. The discussions were quiet, they were exploratory, but they were real, and they reached Anne's ears. Anne was not pleased. Those who know her describe a woman who processes emotion through action rather than expression. She does not raise her voice. She does not make dramatic declarations. But when Princess Anne decides something needs to be done, it gets done. And what she decided in the winter of 2025 was that the family had been operating for too long on incomplete information. Specifically, that the wrong version of Diana's final wishes had been allowed to shape Harry's entire life. Let that sit for a moment. Because what Anne is suggesting with that position is significant. She is not simply correcting a historical misunderstanding. She is saying that Harry has been living out a narrative that was built on a foundation that was never fully true. That decisions he made, distances he created, battles he fought, were all shaped by something he was told or shown or led to believe that did not reflect the complete picture. And Anne believes she was one of the few people still alive who could provide that complete picture. The relationship between Anne and Diana was never simple. That much is well documented. The two women occupied very different spaces within the royal family. Diana arrived as a young woman who knew almost nothing about the institution she was entering. Anne had been born into it. shaped by it from her first breath, had learned its codes, demands, and its unspoken rules long before Diana ever set foot inside a palace. There was friction between them over the years. That is not a secret. Royal biographers have written about it extensively. Anne was not always sympathetic to Diana's public struggles. She was not the warm confidant that some of Diana's other allies were. But here is what those same biographers frequently miss. Anne watched Diana more closely than almost anyone, not with warmth necessarily, but with attention. The kind of attention that only comes from someone who is simultaneously inside the same institution and outside the emotional drama surrounding it. Anne was never swept up in the Diana phenomenon the way the public was. She was never blinded by it. She saw Diana clearly, both the extraordinary qualities and the complicated ones. And in the final year of Diana's life, something shifted between them. Sources who were present in royal circles during 1996 and 1997 describe a quiet and largely unacknowledged change in the dynamic between the two women. The divorce had been finalized. Diana was no longer technically a member of the royal family in the institutional sense. And strangely, that separation from the institution seemed to create a small opening between her and Anne. They were never close, let that be clear, but they spoke. More than people knew. More than either of them was made public. And in those conversations, Diana said things to Anne that she did not say to the press, or to biographers and to the friends whose accounts filled the books published after her death. Anne held on to those things. For 28 years, she held on to them, through the public battles over Diana's legacy, and the arguments about who she really was and what she really wanted, through Harry's departure from royal life and his very public accounting of his own pain. Through all of it, Anne said nothing. People inside the palace assumed Anne's silence was indifference, that she simply did not care enough about the Diana question to engage with it. They thought her famously practical nature made her immune to the emotional weight of the subject. They were wrong. Anne's silence was not indifference. It was a choice, a deliberate and daily renewed decision to keep something protected, until the moment came when keeping it protected was doing more harm than good. That moment arrived in January 2026. What specifically happened in that month to finally move Anne to speak has not been fully confirmed by palace sources. But two separate accounts from individuals close to the royal household describe a private family meeting that took place in the first week of January, a meeting at which the question of Harry's potential return to royal duties was discussed directly. A meeting at which certain claims were made about what Diana would have wanted for her son. Anne listened to those claims, and then Anne, in the measured and unflinching way that defines everything she does, told the room that what was being said was not accurate. She did not stop there. Within days, Anne had agreed to speak on the record about what she knew. Not to a tabloid, or to a television entertainment program, but to a trusted royal historian with impeccable credentials and a track record of serious documented work. The conversation was recorded. Its contents were verified against existing royal archive material before a single word was published. And when those words finally reached the public, the reaction inside the palace was immediate. Because what Anne revealed was not a small correction to the historical record. It was a detonation. The question now is what Diana actually said to Harry. What were the words that Anne has been protecting for nearly 3 decades? And why did those words have the power to reshape everything that came after? That is exactly where we are going next. Do not go anywhere. What Diana actually told Harry. This is the chapter the palace never wanted written. For 28 years, the question has lived in the background of every royal story, Harry interview, documentary, as memoir. What did Diana tell her youngest son before she died? What did she leave him with? What shaped the man he became? The answers have always been partial, fragments from friends, suggestions from biographers, careful hints from people who knew pieces, but never the whole picture. Anne knew the whole picture, and what she has revealed cuts through nearly 3 decades of speculation with the precision of someone who was there, who listened, and who has had a very long time to understand exactly what those words meant. Let us start with the setting. According to Anne, Diana had a private conversation with Harry in the summer of 1997. The exact date has not been disclosed, but sources place it sometime in July, approximately 6 weeks before the crash in Paris. Diana had returned from one of her overseas trips. Harry was at Kensington Palace with her for a few days. before he was due to go to Balmoral with the wider royal family. It was an ordinary summer visit in almost every outward sense. A mother and her son spending time together before a separation neither of them wanted. But Diana had been thinking hard for weeks. Those close to her in that period describe a woman who had become increasingly reflective about the future. Not in a morbid way, but in the way that people sometimes become when life has handed them enough uncertainty that they stop assuming tomorrow is guaranteed. Diana had received threats. That much has been documented across multiple credible sources over the years. The nature and seriousness of those threats has been debated endlessly. But the effect they had on her state of mind in the summer of 1997 was real and documented. She was thinking about her boys and what they would need if she was not there. And she decided that Harry needed to hear something from her directly, not through the palace, or through intermediaries, not through the carefully managed environment of royal life that she had spent years watching distort and reshape the people inside it from her. In her own words, Anne was not present in the room when the conversation happened. Let that be absolutely clear. What Anne knows comes from two sources. The first is Diana herself, who described the conversation to Anne in the days that followed. The second is a private written account that Diana left, which Anne confirms she has read, and which formed the basis of what she has now chosen to disclose. So, what did Diana say to her 12-year-old son on that summer afternoon in 1997? The first thing Diana told Harry was about identity. She told him that who he was had nothing to do with his title, nothing to do with his position in the line of succession, nothing to do with the number of times his name appeared on a ceremonial guest list, or how many times he walked behind a senior royal at a public engagement. She told him that the palace would try to define him, that the institution had a version of Harry already prepared, a role already assigned, a set of expectations already printed and waiting for him to grow into. And she told him not to accept that version without question. Those words alone, delivered to a 12-year-old boy by a mother he worshipped, would have been significant. But Diana did not stop there. The second thing she told him was about the family, and this is where Anne's account becomes genuinely difficult to hear. Diana told Harry that the family he was growing up inside was not always going to protect him the way he needed to be protected. She was not talking about love. She was clear about that, according to Anne. Diana never told Harry that the family did not love him. She was careful about that distinction. But she told him that love and protection inside the royal family were not always the same thing, that the institution had its own survival instincts, that those instincts had, in her own experience, overridden the personal and the human more times than she could count. She told Harry to watch for the moment when the institution's needs and his own needs stopped being the same thing. And she told him that when that moment came, he needed to trust himself above the family's version of what was right for him. A mother telling her 12-year-old son to trust himself over the institution he was being raised to serve. That is not a casual instruction. It is not something said lightly on a summer afternoon. That is a deliberate and considered piece of guidance from a woman who had spent 16 years inside the machine and understood exactly what it was capable of. Anne has confirmed that Diana chose Harry specifically for this conversation because of what she saw in him. Diana believed William had already developed the internal architecture to survive the institution on its own terms. William was older. William was the heir. William had begun building the walls that life inside the palace required. Harry had not. Harry was still open, unguarded. He was still the child who showed everything on his face and held nothing back. Diana loved that about him. She also knew it made him the more vulnerable of the two in the environment they were growing up inside, so she gave him a framework, something to hold on to. But the third thing Diana told Harry is the part that Anne says has never been understood correctly. Diana told Harry about forgiveness, not as a gentle maternal encouragement to be kind, as a survival strategy. Diana had spent years in bitterness. She had earned that bitterness. Every person who knew her story understood why it existed. The marriage that was never what it appeared to be. She had suffered the loneliness inside one of the most public lives on earth, and the humiliation of watching the man she had married love someone else openly and without apology. The stripping of her title after everything she had given to the institution. She had felt all of it, deeply, completely, without the protection that denial might have offered, and she told Harry that the bitterness had cost her. that carrying it had taken years from her that she could not get back, and she had spent enormous energy on anger that she could have spent on living. She told Harry to grieve, to feel everything, to never let anyone tell him his pain was not real or not valid. But she told him not to let the anger become the foundation he built his life on, because that, Diana told her son, was what the institution wanted. An angry Harry was a controllable Harry. An angry Harry could be positioned, managed, and ultimately dismissed. His legitimate pain could be reframed as instability. His valid grievances could be weaponized against him. She had seen it done to others. She had felt it done to herself. And she did not want it done to Harry. Anne has said that this part of Diana's account was the most painful to read, because anyone who has watched Harry's public journey over the last decade cannot help but measure it against Diana's warning. The interviews were filled with raw and unfiltered anger. The memoir that opened wounds across the entire family. The documentaries that positioned every royal relationship as a betrayal. Diana saw it coming, not the specific details, but the shape of it, the pattern of it. A boy who lost his mother at 12. He was handed back to the institution that had broken her, with no escape for processing that loss in any way the palace would recognize as acceptable. Anne has been careful not to say that Harry was wrong to feel what he felt. She has been equally careful not to say that every decision he made was the right one. What she has said is that Diana's instruction to Harry was not a permission slip for war with the family. It was the opposite. Diana told Harry to protect his own peace, to build a life that was genuinely his, to find love that was real and not performative, to do work that meant something to him and not just to the palace image machine. She told him that the bravest thing he could ever do was live happily, not loudly or angrily, not as a weapon pointed back at the people who had hurt him, happily. Whether Harry received that message the way Diana intended it is the question that sits at the heart of everything Anne has now revealed. Whether the years of pain, loss, and palace pressure distorted that message beyond recognition is something that only Harry himself can answer. But Anne has made one thing absolutely clear. Diana did not tell her son to burn the family down. She told him to save himself. Those are not the same instructions. And for nearly 3 decades, the difference between them has been buried under headlines and legal battles and carefully produced documentary series. Now, the difference is on the record, and the fallout from that record being set straight has only just begun. The fallout and what happens next, nothing lands quietly when it involves Diana. That has always been true. It was true when she was alive. It was true the night she died. It has been true every single time her name has surfaced in a royal controversy across the last 3 decades, and it is true now. When Anne's account became known in January 2026, the reaction inside the palace was not measured. It was not composed. It was not the careful and dignified silence the institution typically reaches for when something uncomfortable breaks into the open. It was panic, not the visible kind. The palace is far too practiced for visible panic, but those inside the walls described something they had not felt in years. A loss of control over the narrative. A sense that something had been released that could not be put back. Because Anne had not simply shared a private memory. Anne had dismantled the version of events the palace had spent 28 years carefully maintaining. The version that positioned Harry's departure from royal life as an act of selfishness. This was the version that framed his anger as instability rather than injury, allowed the institution to stand above the wreckage of his childhood and present itself as the reasonable party in an unreasonable situation. Anne had not attacked the palace directly. She had done something far more effective. She had let Diana speak. And Diana's words, even filtered through time and Anne's careful account, landed with a force that no press release could absorb. Within 48 hours of Anne's account becoming public, sources close to Harry confirmed that he had been made aware of what Anne had disclosed. The details of his reaction have not been fully confirmed, but 2 separate individuals familiar with the situation described a man who was shaken, not destabilized, but shaken in the specific way that happens when something you suspected for years is finally confirmed by someone with the credibility to confirm it. Harry had always believed his mother left him something, some piece of guidance, some version of herself that went beyond the photographs and the public appearances and the carefully archived memories. Now he knew what it was. and he knew that the people around him for most of his adult life had allowed him to go through life without it. That realization is not a small thing. Sit with what it means for a moment. A man who has spent years in public conflict with his family and has been portrayed alternately as a victim and a villain, made decisions that cost him relationships, titles, and the country he grew up in, learning that his mother had left him a specific instruction about exactly this situation, an instruction that was known, that was documented, that was held by someone inside the palace for nearly 3 decades. The question that instruction raises is the one nobody inside the palace wants to answer directly. Who else knew? Anne knew. That much is now established, but Anne did not exist in isolation inside the royal family. The private written account Diana left did not sit in a vacuum. It was read, it was known about, and decisions were made, consciously or not, about whether Harry would ever be told what it contained. Those decisions shaped his entire life. Royal commentators who have followed this story since Anne's disclosure have been careful in their language. Nobody has made direct accusations. Nobody has pointed a specific finger at a specific person and said the word withheld. But the shape of the argument is impossible to ignore. Harry grew up inside an institution that knew his mother had left him a message about exactly how that institution operated. A message about identity, about protection, and the difference between the family's needs and his own. About forgiveness as survival rather than surrender. And Harry grew up without that message. What do you think that means? Inside the palace, the response to Anne's disclosure has followed a familiar pattern. No direct comment. No official statement engaging with the substance of what she revealed. A careful and practiced silence designed to neither confirm nor deny, while the news cycle absorbs the impact and moves on. But this story is not moving on. Because Anne is not finished, sources close to the princess have confirmed that what she disclosed in January of 2026 was not the complete account of what she knows. It was the beginning of it. Anne made a deliberate choice about how much to release and when. The private written account Diana left contains more than what has so far been made public. Why Anne is releasing it in stages is a question worth sitting with. Some royal observers believe she is protecting certain relationships inside the family while still ensuring the truth eventually surfaces. Others believe she is watching Harry's response to what has already been disclosed before deciding how much further to go. And a smaller number of those close to the situation believe Anne is sending a message to the palace itself, a reminder that she holds something significant, that the institution's continued management of Diana's legacy has a witness, a senior witness, one who was there and who has decided that silence is no longer the right response. For Harry, the path forward from here is genuinely unclear. The revelation does not automatically repair what has been broken. It does not rebuild relationships that were dismantled publicly and painfully over years. It does not undo the decisions that were made or the words that were said. But it does something important. It confirms that Diana saw him clearly, that she understood exactly what he would face, and she loved him specifically and deliberately enough to leave him a roadmap. Whether Harry can find his way back to that roadmap after everything that has happened is the question that will define the next chapter of his story. Diana told her son to save himself, not through anger or war, but through peace, through a life genuinely and quietly lived on his own terms. The world is watching to see if he finally heard her. Diana spoke. Anne listened. And after 28 years, the truth has finally found its way into the light. If this story moved you, drop your thoughts in the comments below. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more. Diana's legacy is not finished yet.